identify as being African per se, right? But they all said to me, yeah, our parents said, no, they're lazy, they're this, they're that you don't want to associate. And then, the next group said, yeah, well, they told us the same thing. And we had Africans who say, yeah, well, we were told the same thing. And so we're
the lazy you hear, yes.
Yeah, and so we end up with these cultural rifts and
that really get in the way.
Yeah, they do. And my experience similar to Desiree. So my mother's family is African American, and my father's family is Jamaican, and so I have Jamaican, and then he's also part Spanish. We don't know anything about that family or that connection, so. What we connect with is the Jamaican, because that's what the culture, right, we were raised in. But I remember, having friends growing up, and I remember sitting there and listening to this conversation, and we were with some friends of ours who were born and raised in the islands, and they were introducing my mother to somebody, and they were like trying to justify, and they're like, well, you have some, don't you have some Barbadian or some Jamaican up in your family too? And she does, because at some point, right, her people came to the island and then came up here, and she and we can connect, we can trace to it. But it was almost as this makes you okay to be here and be here with us. And so there is this kind of struggle that we have internally, and I think we need to start to move the conversation, like you said, to where we look at more of what we have in common.
Exactly.
But still acknowledge what is different, because there are cultural differences.
And maybe not look down on the cultural differences, because I find, and I hope nobody shoots me on this, but I find Caribbean males very macho. Am I bad? Meaning real macho. Meaning like really I mean, that's what I see. I see a culture that is, that is old-worldy in a way. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Don't shoot me, Brooklyn, but I
can't say you're wrong.
I'm going to say, but do you find that with Southern men?
Not to the same degree. Not to the same degree. There's more of an iron fist when it comes from the West Indian side, and the Southern culture was just a little different. And it's probably because I grew up with it. But you wanted to speak. I hear you.
Yeah, because I've had such a different. have a different take on it, and
maybe it's because your husband's Jamaican.
No,
I mean Trinidadian.
My husband's Trinidadian.
See, there you go. That's the difference.
It has more to do
I'm teasing.
with the fact that both of my parents are West Indian. They're from a small island, Nevis, and I was raised in a household that was very West Indian, and I did not get the messages that I'm hearing.
Yeah,
so I'm hearing you talk about.
Okay.
You're talking about students, and I'm saying to myself, well, is this something new? I'm not. I would imagine that I've never heard my parents speak about African Americans. I've heard them say Americans in general.
Right.
And talk about the fact that this was the land of opportunity, and told us not to take it for granted, and they came here to make a better life, and so that we should take advantage of that. I have heard them say that they felt that perhaps that Americans had things very easy and maybe sometimes took it for granted. But that was the only disparity or only thing that I heard. So when I'm hearing you, I'm a little bit alarmed at that and maybe a little surprised.
Again, qualifiers, it's not everybody, but this is a common conversation.
No, I've heard it. I've heard
common
it.
conversation.
I've definitely heard it, right. Yes.
Tanisha, in your research, what are you finding?
It's definitely not something new. There's always been, because I study or I research early 20th century Caribbean immigration to the U.S., particularly in New York City, and looking at this very topic, the idea of Caribbean American immigrants and African American immigrants and the communities that they form together. And there was always this sense of African Americans believing that Caribbean immigrants thought they were better. Generally, because I studied the Anglophone Caribbean, because they had a connection to the British, and they felt that that was their escape, right? That was a way to separate themselves from the Black community. But at the same time, as all of us are sitting here and you're talking, your mom is African American, your dad is from the Caribbean. your dad is African American, your mom is from the Caribbean. My mom is from St. Lucia, my father is African American. You were married to a Caribbean. So there were always these interactions. There were always, even though there were differences in the community and internal rifts that we had, we still came together.
Absolutely,
As you
right.
can see, we're all the product of.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
so I think it's important to look at the differences, absolutely, because when studying African American history, as I mentioned before, I think it's important to include all of these stories, right? Because the Caribbean American immigrant story is African American history,
Absolutely.
is American history. And I think that's where...
Let's think of Marcus Garvey.
Exactly. And I think that's where we get... I think that's where we find a way forward, by looking at the ways that we work together and built communities together.
You know, because I could not take it for granted that during the civil rights movement, you had Harry Belafonte. He's Jamaican. You know, so we've always found ways to get past, I guess. But
even taking it further back, the
Right.
1920s, the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance,
Claude McKay.
Claude McKay, were Caribbean immigrants, right?
And a lot of
So-
African American icons. I
Yes,
mean,
absolutely.
so that you wouldn't think are
exactly.
Caribbean. So, you know, no one thinks Malcolm X is a Caribbean, you know, American, right? And no one thinks of Minister Louis Farrakhan as a Caribbean American. And we
Even
could keep on
W.E.B.
Shirley
Du Bois.
Chisholm. You know, right? You know, like we could list them all day. You know, figures that are prominent within the African American narrative. But when you take a closer look, you realize, as Tyesha pointed out, you know, that there's always been connectivity between them, and it goes much
from
deeper.
where we all came from in terms of our ancestry.
It comes from a shared
perhaps?
colonial history. I mean,
right.
so if you want to
right.
go down south and you look at, you know, places like Louisiana, you can't separate Louisiana's history from Haiti's history. You know, the Louisiana, if we're going to get into a history lesson, the Louisiana Purchase went through because of the Haitian Revolution, right? You know, there was movement of people between Louisiana and Haiti as the revolution was going on. So there is a shared history. But, and I think sometimes we're too hard on ourselves when we talk about our own identity politics. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that historically we've struggled to redefine ourselves, and in that struggle, you know, sometimes we give ourselves the burden of figuring it out. You know, much of what I've heard shared here, we could have the same conversation with a group of Italians and have exactly the same results. And you know, you sit with Italians and they'll tell you, well, no, don't mess with that population or that population because they're bad, or you know, or whatever. Find yourself a nice Italian girl. You know, find yourself a nice Jewish girl. You know, these conversations take place in all communities. So I don't think we should be too hard on ourselves because we sometimes pay too much attention to the divisions between us rather than the things which unify us.
And in terms of our unifiers, aside from what we see in terms of politics and what we see in this country from a cultural perspective, what are those areas that we would be able to unify on that are culturally based?
Okay.
I hope that's a question you could guess.
Yeah, sure. Music was one.
Perfect.
You know, and you don't have to you know, be a Brooklynite to appreciate that. You know, a beef patty, a Jamaican beef patty is
man, I'm hungry.
is
Everybody likes it.
right. You know, it unifies everybody. Like, no one's going to argue with you about it. And as these cultures merge more and more, you'll find that, you know, so the people who are walking into a Jamaican restaurant or a Caribbean restaurant, not necessarily only Caribbean. Music-wise, the genres are blending. Earlier you started talking about, you know, the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the English-speaking.
Reggaeton. I knew that was coming.
Reggaeton is nothing but.
But let's go back to the food for a second, because one of the things I think that's interesting is that a lot of the areas that we're talking about all have the same foods, but they call them different names and they fix them differently, right? And so if you look at
And argue about it.
yeah,
If you want to talk about dividers, is it curry chicken or chicken curry? Right, it's real.
or is
They'll argue about
is it spinach or is it
Is it callaloo?
So but we're eating the same things, right? It's just prepared based on our regional, our location at the time when we were in that state of mind.
Exactly.
Or in the process of doing the cooking.
And my not coming from New York City, it wasn't as though I saw the kind of ethnic diversity that you see here in New York City. The idea that we have enclaves, do you think that sort of perpetuates some of these issues that you, in fact, were talking about, Maria, in terms of people having certain ideas around what the other is like?
So I'm not sure if the enclaves are the ones perpetuating the idea, because the folks I'm talking to, they're getting this before they get here. All right, and so I can give you this great example. And this was years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And we were doing a class, and we were talking about these intercultural dialogues that need to be going on. And I had two students, it was one student in particular, and she identified as African American, right? African in America. But her family was all from Trinidad. And she said, she talked about all the warnings that she got and how she would get and she was born here, but she still gets those warnings. And she said she would get into arguments with her family because she would say, my brother and I are African American. She's like, we are American citizens, we're African descent, we were born here. Yes, we have a Trinidadian culture in the house, but they're like, no, you're Trinidadian, you're Trini. They're like, that's my culture, but that's not how I'm identifying. I'm growing up in America. I have been Americanized. Everything that I see and I do, I'm doing it in American society. So we are African American. And she said that's a running battle because her family, her extended family, would not accept that was their perspective.
I was going to say, I think that's also important to point out the differences between Caribbean immigrants who are just arriving, like new
First generation and second
versus
generation.
the second
That's
and
right.
third generation.
Right.
I think there are
Interesting.
also differences even between that mindset of what you were saying.
Right.
A second generation Caribbean immigrant might completely embrace the African American identity because they were born here. They understand the culture more than someone who has just arrived, right? Especially as someone who comes as a fully formed adult who already has their culture.
That's right. Fully formed makes a big difference. And I guess that's where we're going to leave it. Take the best from both worlds. So thank you, Dr. Irish-Bramble, Dr. De Longoria, and Dr. Maddox for informing this conversation. And,
Thank
you
you for
know,
having us.
the idea that having these kinds of dialogues, Brooklyn Savvy strives to bring people together. So thank you for participating in this. And we'll see you next time on Brooklyn Savvy.